So if you need another reason to ditch the Gantt chart, Henry Gantt, his father was a slave holder, and much of the idea around breaking tasks up into small pieces and kind of dangling carrots to get people to do more work was what he learned from growing up with his father managing the slaves that he owned.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Brave New Work, a podcast about reinventing our organizations and the search for a more adaptive and human way of working. I'm Aaron Dignan, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Rodney Evans.
Hello, friends.
And today, we're joined by our friend and colleague, Sharan Bal, a partner at the Ready. Sharan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Hello, world.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about exploring JEDI, that's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and its role in Brave New Work. But before we dig into that, let's explore a check-in round.
We will, we must, and we'll ask Sharan to do it because that's what happens when our friends and colleagues come on the show. So Sharan, check us in. Empowerment.
Empowerment indeed. I will seize that authority and check us in. So let's check in by sharing what we think our listeners should know about us and our social identities before we get into this conversation, just so they know where we're coming from.
Got it. Okay. You go first so we know how to do it right.
Okay. So I am a cisgendered woman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm relatively on the younger side, I guess, in the workforce, in my early 30s. I am British. I was born in England, but ethnically I'm Punjabi, which means I'm from the north of India, and have grown up across England, the US, and also Hong Kong. So that's why my accent sounds very odd. So I bring kind of that global perspective in terms of how I think about this topic, and still have much to learn in this space as well.
Nice. Okay, cool. So I am a white, straight male, and I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up without a ton of money or connections or anything like that, but my family was definitely upwardly mobile. I'm short. I'm like 5'6", 5'7", if I kind of wear shoes with very big soles. No disabilities to speak of. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right. I am also white and heterosexual and married to a dude who I talk about a lot on this podcast. And I am in my early 40s. I'm turning 42 on Monday. Right? 42? That's right. I always forget, but I think that's right. And I've been very interested in exploring these identities recently, and particularly in exploring white women's roles in the perpetuation of white supremacy and racial injustice in this country. And so those are identities that I've not thought critically about so much in the past as I am now. Or if I did, it was through the lens of being the victim of the patriarchy, not through the lens of being the oppressor. So a lot of opening and work to do around those identities that I carry. So Sharan, we're super excited to sort of map the territory with you. There's so much to say about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I suspect that this will be the beginning of a series of unfolding conversations, because there's no way we can get to everything that we want to in one short podcast episode. But why don't we just start with talking a little bit about those terms? So, where did you start hearing those terms that you have sort of brought to us at the Ready to be considering? And what is the difference between them?
Yeah, great. So the diversity and inclusion are probably the more common terms we hear often. And so I'll start with explaining those a bit. They'll probably be familiar to folks, but diversity is really about asking who is in the room, who is in the organization, and what identities do these people hold? And then inclusion is asking who has a seat at the table. So do the diverse identities that we have in the organization have agency over their voice? And are they able to interact in the organization? Are they included in ways that are beneficial to them and everyone else as well? And so that's the common terms that we hear talked around a lot: diversity, inclusion, D&I. And then I heard about JEDI from, I'm not sure who developed it, but I first heard about it from folks at US Climate Action Network. Shout out to the organizers. And so justice is looking at a more holistic framework or a more holistic system. And I find Cornel West's definition of justice to be just really easy and simple, that it's what love looks like in public. And so that's what I think about when I think about justice. What does it mean to have a system that is grounded in justice and really a demonstration of love in public? And then equity is asking not just who's in the room and who has a seat at the table, but it's asking what resources are being allocated to the marginalized voices at the table. It requires acknowledging whose voices are typically not heard, or which voices are not privileged in our society. And, can we allocate resources in a way, lift those voices up in a way, listen to what their needs are and prioritize those so that we really have true fairness. And that's different from equality, which is more about saying, well, everybody gets a t-shirt. We learned this from our partner, Taye Sherrod. She says, with equality, everybody gets a t-shirt, but equity is about making sure everyone gets a t-shirt that fits. And so if you think about JEDI as the order of the terms as well, I find that really helpful, because it's about saying, let's focus on justice and equity first in order to get true diversity and inclusion in a way that's not tokenizing or harmful as well.
And I feel like we often do it in the opposite order, where it's like, hey, let's get some folks that look different than us in here. And then suddenly they're not having a great time and they're leaving and everybody's like, what gives?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting order.
I think one of the things that's exciting about this moment, certainly for people who are systems thinkers and org designers, is that the language around systems design has really come to the forefront. And, it's certainly the first time, as a non-scholar of these topics, it's certainly the first time that I have seen really, like, everywhere discussions about how systems are designed and whose table is it that we're inviting people to, and what does it, if we talk about equity, that means equity in the eyes of people who have been marginalized, not in the eyes of the historic systems designers, and things like this that are, to me, feel very intuitive because of the kind of work that we do. But historically, to your point, Aaron, having been in and around DEI conversations in large companies a bit, it has been very centered on the individual rather than on the system. And it's been more centered on, like, percentages and recruitment tactics and and representation. And I'm not saying that, like, that isn't also a part of it, but
For sure.
To the point about systems design, it's like, what happens for people when they actually enter a system that is not designed to welcome or nurture or really truly include them?
Yeah. And I feel like we're also seeing, specifically with the issues around police brutality and, the way that policing happens in different communities, that, like, the part about emergent properties and org debt that unfolds without necessarily even a designer at the helm is also really prevalent. And so it's like there's a part of this that's obviously designed very consciously to benefit and preference certain folks. And there's also the part of it that's just like, when you just let a system roll, when you just, like, let the chili cook for, 100 years, all kinds of weird stuff creeps out. And if you're not looking at it through the lens of, like, what are our tensions? What are we going to try? Like, what can we do? What interventions are we going to, employ? Then it's not surprising to see both really positive and really super negative stuff happen.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So we're already starting to get into the conversation that we want to have, but I guess I'd like to just ask you, Sharan, like from your perspective, what is the conversation about, at least for the Ready in this moment of Black Lives Matter and this like sort of cultural zeitgeist?
Yeah. So I think it's important to name that the Black Lives Matter movement's been around for 7 years, I think, nearly. And it's only now that it's become so mainstream and accepted, that white people especially are waking up to all the work that needs to be done. And polls are showing that they care a lot about this and see racial injustice as a big issue. So I think at the Ready, we're really grappling with, we've known we have work to do around our JEDI, JEDI work, and not wanting to feel a rush to come out with a statement or have anything to say. But I think it's more important to use this moment in time to really explore and reflect, what does this mean for us? What lessons can we take from what the Black Lives Matter movement has done to create awareness and action across all kinds of organizations, to look at what it means for us at the Ready, but also what it means for our work. And so I think the conversation is really just us starting to explore that connection and explore what we can learn. It's not designed to be like, listen to this podcast and learn how to become an anti-racist organization or anything like that. We have a lot more to learn in the space than we have to teach. So this is really just us exploring in the hopes that our exploration helps others and theirs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, so I have like a giant whiteboard with the OS canvas in my office, and and I put it there when when the calls for defunding the police became very loud. I was like, that's really interesting to me in terms of what fields of the canvas that touches, and what the starting points are. And what I realize is, unlike when we, for example, did this series, Ready for Anything, about the pandemic, like I think Aaron and I had very strong views on sort of what went in the containers. Like we were like, in remote work, in decentralized environments, in a more networked situation, this is how you should think about meetings or how you should think about information. Where my mind is right now is like, I still believe that we have a lot to provide and support in terms of the containers, but I'm very interested in the people who are at the center of this telling us like what goes in them. So like when you think about something like defunding the police, I'm like, cool. That sounds right. Like that sounds right based on what people who know more than I do are saying. And then what I get curious about is like, okay, in terms of like the other fields of the canvas that resourcing impacts, how do you think about that? So if you're going to move money, what does that mean in terms of strategy? Or what does that mean in terms of authority or structure or information? So like, I feel like in this moment for me personally, like sitting where I sit in the Ready, I'm just noticing the containers and really trying to listen, particularly to like Black experts who know about the content of what should go in those containers.
It's super interesting to me because I do start to look at the content ideas and the way they're then employed from the lens of like, what's the difference between evolution and revolution? And most of the stuff we talk about at work is not about overthrow. It's not about like burn it down and rebuild. It's more about like, how can we all as agents in the system use our consent to like experiment our way to a better tomorrow, right? And so when you think about something like defund the police as an idea, I immediately go to like, okay, so we want to do that. So then how do we want to do that? Do we want to do it as a kind of a top-down move that comes from political pressure where we just like do it? Do we want to do it in partnership or not in partnership with the people that it will affect on both sides or not? Is it an experiment or not? Like, what are we really saying when we say that? And I think because we don't have a lot of practice at social level, community level experimentation and looping and learning, there's a lot of different people reading into that different ways. So it's like, some people read that and they're like, no way, dude, what if someone attacks me on the street? And other people are like, no, what we mean is we're going to like reinvent what it means to police society with different kinds of agents, with different kinds of skills, and we're going to move money around. And like that is obviously a lot more palatable to someone who doesn't understand. So I don't know. I think you're right, Rodney, that it is so much about these containers and what fills them. And we're probably not the right people to like write out that script. But I do think we're the right people to ask questions about like, well, how do we actually play that out then in a way that is either disruptive on purpose or less disruptive in order to maintain some sense of, connection and civility at a community level?
Yeah. And in the police example, very specifically, like to me, it's been really interesting to watch the conversation unfold around like, school resource officers and funding and mental health professionals, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like all of those things that I read about seem logical to me and rational to me. And then also it begs the question for me of like, are we clear on what the purpose is of police in our society?
Right. Yeah. Back to the purpose box.
If your belief is that the purpose of the police is to like protect white people from other people, then that's one kind of design. And if your belief is that the police are there to like support a vibrant community that's inclusive, then that's a different kind of design. And it's like, to me, there's like all of the discussion of roles around policing is super interesting and feels like the right conversation. And I'm also like, how could the conversation happen? And maybe it's just like it has to be fractal or it has to be local or it has to be state. I don't know. But how does the conversation happen that's like, this is the purpose of this team and this is what we're designing for? Because to me, things like role clarity and authority like naturally shake out of that. But I think there's a lot of polarity in terms of what people believe the police should and should not be doing.
Yeah. I think the conversation more recently has even shone a light on what the purpose of the police is. And so I think the thing that's happening right now is everyone's studying up, or everyone who cares is studying up on a lot of history around these things. So I don't think in the past 7 years there had been, at least I'll speak from my perspective, as much questioning into what is the purpose of the police. And look, right? A lot of what we do in our work is we talk to organizations about the history of the OS and how it evolved and what the assumptions were around it that we don't even fully realize, but we're like living in it and swimming in it. And so I think that's really what's happening now. I don't think we were saying a few years ago, look, non-Black people were not saying as much a few years ago. The police were essentially designed to protect white people from non-white people. And now we're kind of able to have that awareness even, right? That's the first step, is getting aware of what is the system and how does it work. I think the question around evolution or revolution or how we get there, it's a tough one. And I go back to the authority field of the canvas. I think the authority is so concentrated with a few, with police chiefs, with their relationships with cities. And it's just, compounded over time and created a real power imbalance. And I think the cool thing that's happening with Defund the Police is we're opening up that information field of the canvas, right? Pushing for more transparency. Like I think just the other day, 3,500 people, and that didn't account for the people that were camping out at City Hall in New York, like 3,500 people listened to the budget hearing in New York City, right? And it's creating this this engagement and this power distribution in a way, just by opening things up and creating more of that accountability. And I don't think we'll be able to talk about what it means to really redesign these systems until that authority gets further distributed and there's more accountability to realizing, oh, like people do care about this, our constituents and citizens care about this. And I'm also super curious to learn what ends up happening in Minneapolis. I guess we'll have a lot to learn from their experiment too.
Yeah, there's definitely that and others happening. It's also interesting to me to note, I mean, you know, Rodney, you keep connecting this back to the work. And the other piece of this that really hits home for me that I don't even know how to sit with exactly, but we always say, like, it's not the people, it's the system. And what's interesting about that is when you look at this situation, obviously there are some pretty serious bad actors in the system doing things that are unforgivable. And also there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are just in a system that was designed to do exactly what you said, Sharon, in ways both subtle and not subtle. And I wonder about the way that we talk about that entire group and that entire community in the lens of, or through the lens of, is it the people, is it the system, and what's the interplay between the two? Because it is interesting to play the game of like, oh yeah, in Camden, they, defunded the police, they rebuilt the system, they rehired a lot of the people, and those very same people are acting in a different way. And so, it's not that everybody can do that. There are definitely some people that just have to go. But, what do you think about that?
I've thought a lot about that. And, we've had some challenging conversations inside our own company recently about
For sure.
the people aspect of systems and what powerful nodes in a network can do. And sometimes, as we are seeing in this movement, there are people who are making like incredible amounts of change with fairly limited authority, which is like kind of unbelievable to see. I've seen like huge protests in my own city that are organized by a couple of teenagers who use social media and get 10,000 Durhamites downtown peacefully protesting and singing beautiful songs together. It's awesome to see. And then conversely, we see bad actors, to your point, Aaron, and a lot of people who have put those bad actors into power and continue to keep them there.
And support them, yeah.
To me, it's like I am beyond saying that it is one or the other, and I fundamentally believe that these things work in concert. But what I'm looking at in this moment is like, how do we design the kinds of organizations, whether you're talking about police or you're talking about a company or you're talking about a local government, how do we design the kinds of organizations where people don't have to overcome the OS in order to do the right thing?
Yeah.
And that, and when you hear people say like, not all cops and not all cops, et cetera, my basic take on that is like, do I believe that every police officer in America is fundamentally a monster? No, I do not. Do I believe that the ones who are acting really morally are doing so in contravention in some way of the system that they work in? Yeah, I do. Yeah. And so I'm like, how do we start to design systems where people are more incented and directed and nudged and socially pressured to behave in the right way? And how do we rely less on like ethical behavior or moral or individualistic moral compasses to heroically overcome what is being signaled? And this is true in terms of police. It's true in terms of companies. It's true in terms of like, how people have historically been criminalized and like the school to prison pipeline for young Black people in our country. It's like you have countless examples of people overcoming the shit system that they were born into and the funnel through which they've been traveling. But like, good for those people, and let's not rely on that. That's like
That is
start
not
to
good
look
enough.
at those funnels and be like, why does it take that level of effort or disruption to not succumb to, what the system is designed for?
It's the classic exceptionalist argument, right? Like
Exactly.
somebody became a millionaire, so we don't have a problem with inequality. It's
That's
like,
right.
dude,
Let's
seriously?
let's not ever say that again. Yeah. The
Yeah.
bootstrap argument from like my boomer family members is one that I enjoy having a lot.
Yeah, I also think it's just that place we go to. I mean, we see it in organizations a lot, and we mentioned this earlier, but there's a lot of focus on implicit bias training and being aware of your individual biases, and that is absolutely fundamental work to do, and we can't rely on that alone, because as we know, investment in these kinds of trainings don't really pay off when the system that you interact with doesn't reinforce those behaviors, right? The police have been, a lot of police systems have been using anti-bias training, for the past 7 years, there's been demands for more of this, as a result of what's been happening for many, many years, killings that have happened over many years. So it's a both. You need both. You can't just rely on getting folks to go to a training and then hoping that they'll change when the system is just still encouraging the wrong kind of behavior. And we see that a lot in organization. I think that's the part of what excites me about the connection between JEDI and Brave New Work, is just more of that focus on, like, what if we just acknowledge that the organizations we work in are designed for white men. I mean, that's how they were created. They were designed for white men to be able to control people and generate profits, all the way back to Taylor and scientific management, and that's still the system. And so while implicit bias training and all this education is absolutely important, and get some diversity councils going and affinity groups and all of that, but let's have the conversation around how we reinvent an OS that is not so grounded in white supremacy, but that could work for everyone.
I couldn't agree more, Sharon. And I think it's in some ways it's no different than any other type of change.
Yeah.
And how many clients have come to us because they've done something like an old school change management effort or an old school agile implementation, and they're like, we did a bunch of training and nothing happened. And it's like, I think one of the things, we know better than that. Like, we know that what training is great for is awareness creation. But if you don't go a layer deeper into the practices that bring it to life, it doesn't go beyond awareness creation. And maybe you have people whose eyes are a bit, like their aperture is a bit wider, but that doesn't do much in terms of actually shaping behavior. And I feel like, a couple of things that have happened at the Ready in the last year, to me, have been good examples of how this actually works in the work. And so, one of the things that Sharon, you and I have worked really hard on is around our hiring process. And, we don't need to spend a lot of time on that here. And we have other episodes about it. But one of the things that I've reflected on as I've been thinking more about systemic injustice is the fact that even though our first principle for designing that process was reducing bias and increasing diversity in terms of the Ready's future hires, that was our first principle. But to me, the real conversations and the real learning happened in the more controversial design choices that raised people's hackles, and particularly raised the hackles of white men in our system, when we were like, we think that we should nudge these kinds of metrics. And we think this question might be filtering out people who are not white men who haven't had access to this thing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think what's been and similarly in some of our recent conversations about different compensation structures, my point is just that the rubber meets the road when you start making real choices about the practices that confront the historical scientific management, control oriented design that you're talking about. And until you get into that conversation where you're like, no, dude, for real, we are going to make a filtering decision differently for people that look like you than for people that look like her. Until you get into that level of granularity, it's all sort of like theoretical and pretty easy to sign up for.
Right.
And as the resident white dude in the room, a good clue that you're on the right track is when you're like, hey, wait a second. Like
I don't
if you're looking at a design choice and you have a gut level reaction that like, wait, that doesn't feel right. It probably is.
Yeah.
And so I have learned to tune into that particularly through the hiring process. Like, wait, a lot of my, preferences about how we hire and how we filter and when and how we make choices, are just that. They're just preferences, and they're often born of a tradition and a set of privileges that get exercised and get a certain result. So I think tuning into discomfort is especially useful here. And the other thing I wanted to say that's sort of unrelated, but Sharan, you just sort of threw this out, and I was like, whoa, light bulb. I've never thought about the fact that our modern way of working, which the Ready is often, banging pots and pans, yelling about how it was invented on a factory floor 100 years ago. But like that predates the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so really naming and knowing that and saying like, wait a second, most of the things we do, how we budget, how we set up authority, how we set up hierarchy, how we do roles and responsibility, like all that stuff was born in a time where we were like decades prior to a civil rights movement. And honestly, like just getting around to letting women have the vote. And so that is just, I think, a really powerful idea. And I wanted to like give that some time.
Yeah. And Sharan, like maybe for our listeners, and we can link that Boston Review article that I don't know if it was Urian who shared it or you who shared it originally, but that shit blew my mind.
Yeah. It was, it was pretty great to learn about. I mean, I think it made me reflect on a lot of things, right? If we were out in the world talking about how the legacy OS and Taylorism is grounded in slavery and kind of born out of that, would our work be as successful? Would we be as well received? Probably not. So there, when we talk to organizations and the reason they want to change, it's less, hey, we have realized our OS is pretty oppressive. It's more, how do we be more productive? How do we be more adaptive? We realize we're not going to be successful moving forward. And so I've always had this feeling in my gut around, well, this movement, Brave New Work, is really about creating a more just world. Like for me, that's why I'm called to be here. And so then to connect it to the history of like, oh, it's like grounded in quite problematic history, right? I mean, slavery was an economic system, and then those systems just evolved into new systems to oppress that were more socially acceptable at the time. And the article talks about how there were congressional hearings in, I think, 1911, because Congress was concerned about scientific management feeling a little bit like slavery. And Taylor at the time, I think, said, well, no, he did not have a very people positive response. The assumption was, well, we, as like Black workers need the white managers to basically educate them and make choices for them because they don't know better. And then the article also, I learned about how Henry Gantt, so if you need another reason to ditch the Gantt chart, this is one of them. I mean, his father was a slave holder, and much of the idea around breaking tasks up into small pieces and kind of dangling carrots to get people to do more work for the pay, the wage that was associated with that task, was what he learned from growing up with his father managing the slaves that he owned. So that was also very fascinating. And so you have that history also parallel with what you're talking about, Aaron, with like the civil rights movement, and then even like the labor movement, and how that excluded Black workers for a very long time. And then the moment they were allowed to get involved, it was like, well, we better like limit unions and make sure that unions don't have as much impact. And so all of those things together have kind of created the OS that we swim in now. And, you know, I'm just hopeful that more of the conversation around JEDI moving forward can be less about how do we work within the system that we currently have to, you know, include more voices and move towards like, we just need a fundamentally different OS if we really want to be anti-racist, if we really want to be feminist.
And I really want to ask you guys in this moment, because it feels to me like when we talk about history, I think, Sharon, you're exactly right. Like the siren song that CEOs can hear is like, this is no longer serving. And, you know, you've gotten what you can out of efficiency and now you need something new. And frankly, I did not know nearly as much as I do now about the history of scientific management and why it's jacked. Besides the sort of factory floor orientation. What I'm wondering now that I want to ask you guys is like, how might we incorporate more of this particular language? And now that we know more than we knew 6 months ago, like it feels to me like there's an opportunity to work in more of the historical roots of these designs into how we talked in order to disrupt patterns for ourselves, but also within the organizations that we work in. And like, Sharon, I hear you that like we probably hold some assumption about what's palatable and what's not palatable. And I'm just wondering like, how true is that assumption and what might we try? Because as a person who's been using like the words white supremacy in a very white and traditional client organization a lot recently, like I haven't gotten fired yet. And so I'm just curious, like, you know, what could we be doing differently?
It's a really good question. I'm glad you're talking about it with your client. I think that's the first step, is what I'm learning and hearing about is, are we just naming it for what it is? Because I don't, you know, even just little things like talking about being agile or being more productive, are we doing that more than we're talking about being just or being more human or being more compassionate? And so I'm starting to notice, like, what is the language that I'm using or trending towards, and how is that kind of complicit? And so I do want to start naming more intentionally, like this connection, talking a lot more about power and control than agility and productivity, and just helping clients see that connection and understand more that like the practices that we're introducing in many ways are designed to distribute power and also disrupt like a lot of what research has shown around what white supremacist culture looks like. Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun have kind of done a lot of work to outline some characteristics that get at what this culture looks like, white supremacist culture. And a lot of what we're doing with making more complexity conscious and more people positive OSs is like disrupting perfectionism, disrupting paternalistic leadership and power hoarding, and getting people to disrupt either or thinking, and thinking there's only one right way, and start to really embrace complexity. And so I wonder if there's more room for me to play with just talking about distribution of power and talking about disrupting some of this culture, because the reason I think obviously I don't think we're going to be having to worry about getting fired, but a lot of the clients that we're working for are starting to wake up to this as well and care about this, right? Are starting to want to do work around racial justice and really bring it into their work. And so I think there's a lot more room for us to make that connection for them. And that often starts with just naming it for what it is, and sitting in some of my own discomfort I have around that as a young woman of color and in the workplace. I do definitely sometimes get worried about some of the language that I use, but I'd love to play with more of that.
Yeah, this is so interesting to me because like it's right at the crux of it for us. And I think it's incredibly complex. Like this makes my mind light up in every possible corner of itself about like, all right, first of all, what are we trying to do? Again, back to like revolution or evolution. What power do we have as the Ready in that context? How have other context clues told us a story about what it takes? So like, this is not a movement that just happened. This is a moment and a movement that happened in the midst of a global pandemic with 45 million people out of work, a lot of them white, a lot of them black. There's a very particular chemistry going on right now that enables this kind of action. And so I want to tune into that. And I want to notice that like, even with a client who's on board, even with a client who like really sees this potential, the economic operating system has to be changed as well. Right. And so like the idea that we can just be like, fuck agility, fuck adaptivity, fuck performance, like that's not going to happen until we can also address the other side of this equation, which is the economic OS. And even then, I think, I want to be clear that like the goal here is not to abolish a world in which people have different outcomes. The goal is to abolish a world in which people don't have equity and, inclusion and a seat at the table at the starting line. And so I think that, there's just a lot to this. And my sense is that like, it's a little bit of boil the frog or peel the onion, where I see JEDI in the outcomes of our work, whether we say it or not. And I think saying it more, especially in the beginning, is actually really valuable right now, both just like ethically and morally. And also, like, believe me, I am the first one who's like, hey, can I vilify the old way of working more? Great. Like, give me the tools. And so I think it's interesting to start to say, like, it's not just a Gantt chart. It's not just a pain in the ass. Like, it's literally something that comes from, a racist origin. And so that to me is very interesting. And I'm very curious to play with that and see how people sit with that and how they react. And if that helps us move faster. And just as someone that's done this for a long time, I really believe in the Karate Kid paint the fence, wax the car modality, which is like, if I just have someone doing a check-in round, if I have someone distributing authority, if I have someone playing the game differently, if they're painting the fence, and then suddenly I'm like, JEDI karate a little bit. I actually think that's still valuable. So I don't want to risk breaking the pattern of continuous unfolding that I see in work culture in order to be aggressively in favor of revolution. And as a human being, I'm kind of there. And so I feel like there's a little schism or delta there that I'm still sorting out and sensing into.
I actually think I hear you. And I actually think there could be room for more opening with some aspects of what we're doing, right? So you all have been in an earlier episode talking about transparency, particularly with compensation. And that's just still an area where, to, like Rodney, you said, people get really nervous about. And it's like, what? We can't make compensation transparent. And I think if you use the argument of, well, it will, help people feel more engaged or more included, like these other reasons, wasted, you don't waste as much energy and swell. You have more complexity because you're more complexity conscious because more people are kind of sensing the real work that's happening and advocating for their pay. But if you also use the lens of JEDI, it's like, how could we not make compensation transparent? Like that's been one of the biggest things for me with working at the Ready is it's the first place I've worked where I know what everyone's making. And as a woman of color at work, like it's the first place I've worked where I haven't been disproportionately underpaid for my work, and that's very real. That has very real consequences for the life that I'm living. And so I think with certain things that we advocate for, how can the language we use and the lens we bring to it actually create more of an opening to take that step when I think sometimes clients are a bit nervous because it's like, I can't quite make the connection between why making compensation transparent will help me be more adaptive.
I like that.
Me too. And the other thing it brings up for me is just like, basic sort of behavioral psychology, which is that people change because they want to go towards something or because they want to move away from something. And I think a lot of what we have talked about with clients is what they are trying to move toward, right? We spend a lot of time on the outcomes that they're seeking to achieve and the purpose that they want to coalesce around, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in terms of avoidance, we certainly nod to disengagement and extractive practices in organizations. And people like get that on a personal level. But I think there is something else compelling for us to start folding into the conversation that is about moving away from racist systems. And that like there is, compensation being a great example, Sharan, and looking at the historical roots of people like Taylor and Gant and looking at how compensation practices uphold traditionally white supremacist systems. Like that's just true. Like that just is true. Not having people have agency over how they are paid, what they make, able to see others' information, like having people who generally fall along certain racial and gendered lines being in better positions to negotiate or having more leverage or having more generational security so that they're less reliant on these blah, blah, blah. We could do a whole episode just on that. But my point is that like what's emerging for me and what I'm learning in this conversation is there is a very important argument that people have made, but we have not yet made and in our languaging around the why of transforming systems that has to do with dismantling white supremacy.
And that lands well with me, particularly at that practice level, where I feel like, when you zoom back to like the reason to do transformation at all, I think this is one of those reasons for sure, because it's something to move away from. And there are the things to move towards that we talk about all the time. So there's like a lot of different colors, on the painting there for reasons to play. But once you're playing, I think it's totally valid to just be like, oh, that practice, that's a racist practice. Don't do that.
Don't do
and
that.
Like that to me seems really clean. It seems a lot cleaner than saying like we should transform organizations exclusively to be anti-racist. Where I feel like we have a lot more to play with at that level. But down at the practice level, it's that, I don't know, that just like intuitively lands with me that like that would work.
Yeah,
which is
resumes,
all I care about.
That's racist.
Yeah. Stop it.
So this has been a riveting exploration, but I'm curious to know what is next for us, specifically as members of the Ready and as we work on our own OS. We've talked a bit about what this means for us in our work with clients, but what's next for us at the Ready and how we're evolving our OS based on what we're learning about JEDI?
Well, I mean, the first thing that jumps to mind for me, there's the obvious stuff, right? I mean, we revamped the hiring process. We're trying very hard, I think, to grow the diversity aspect of what's going on at the Ready, and I think we're succeeding, or we're going to succeed. I'm excited about that. But actually, the piece that I'm sitting most with from the training that we did with Taye together at our last retreat was this idea of like, can we learn to be in conversation about this stuff without letting the difference between intent and impact derail us and make us feel blame and guilt and fear. And I see so many people out in the world right now, particularly people that look like me, being like, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to screw up. And that means that we can't have a conversation. And so then nothing's going to change. And I just really worry about that. And so I want to like build a culture of capacity where we can say stuff, say the wrong stuff, thrash around in it together, and like do that in a space of connection and love and openness. And to me, that's just a skills thing and a practice thing. So even though it doesn't feel maybe like as action oriented as people might hope, I actually just like, I'd love to finish the year being really good at talking about this stuff together.
Nice.
I think for me, there are two things that are on my mind besides continuing to really try to like do the right things in hiring. One is we've taken another pass at our essential intent, and Sharan, I know you are working on specific language that has to do with JEDI that becomes a part of our essential intent. I'd really like for that to be something that we as a group are compelled by and somewhat maybe provoked by, and that we figure out in terms of our own operating rhythm how we are looking at that essential intent more frequently to see if what we are actually doing from an initiative perspective and from a connection perspective and from all of the perspectives, like, are we doing it? Like, are we doing the things that are going to bring us toward the thing that we say that we want, essentially? And then the other piece that has been on my mind and has been a bit controversial at the Ready, and I just think we fundamentally have more work to do, is about how we value different parts of our work. And, I think we have coalesced a bit around the understanding that paying for the tip of the spear in terms of things like sales is something that is potentially sexist and probably racist. And it doesn't mean that we should necessarily stop doing that, but we should look more holistically at the value creation from ideas that happen in conversation straight through delivery that makes our clients more productive, more adaptive, and more rich, frankly, and get smarter about that, because we understand how much of the laboring in value streams in any organization is done by women and people of color and marginalized communities, and that is often not recognized from a compensation perspective in the same way as the more performative, externally facing sort of theatrical aspects of our work, which also tend to fall along the lines of white people and white men. Those things tend to be more compensated, and not just in our system, but in many systems. And so I'm interested in both the essential intent piece, and then particularly around our pay practices, what feels equitable to everyone all of whom are like, trying to figure this out and wanting to recognize the hard work that contributes to our commons.
Awesome. I'm excited for both those things. Yeah. The only thing I would add that you both didn't mention is it's been really interesting to sit with the equality versus equity conversation, and to prioritize equity. It has to be equity even over equality, and so much of self-management and the way we work at the Ready is really grounded in equality, right? Everybody has the same rights to bring a proposal for how we should work, to propose governance, to raise attention, to participate in our system and in Slack or in meetings. And so I'm curious about what changes we need to make in more subtle ways across the OS, whether it's in how we meet, or how we do governance, even how we make decisions, that is more grounded in equity rather than equality. But yeah, I'm excited to just start like exploring that and having that conversation, and then bring some changes as they evolve and make sense.
Well, it sounds like we have lots to do.
Yeah.
We're busy. And with all that in mind, maybe we should draw things to a close. So let me say, Sharan, thank you so much for joining us today. And
thanks so much for having me. It was really great.
Rodney, of course, always a pleasure as well.
That was rad. I got a voicemail this morning from my best friend who said that we are doing an amazing job on this podcast. And if that isn't true, I don't know what is. So if you agree with my best friend Hollis, please go leave us a review, preferably with like all the stars, because that's great. We love to hear your comments. We read all of them, and reviews and forwards and sharing help get this podcast into the hands of those who will dig it and who will use it and who will make work better as a result.
Awesome. And as always, quick tip of the hat to Taylor Marvin for making us sound good in the studio. Brave New Work is produced by The Ready, where we help organizations around the world change the way they work. You can get in touch with us by emailing podcast@theready.com. And as for you, thanks for listening. Now go change something.